They are unanimous in their hatred of me, and I welcome their hatred. So said Franklin D. Roosevelt after putting in place legislation that would protect Americans from the financial abuses that had caused the 1929 Depression. He was referring, of course, to the powerful bankers of Wall Street. Wall Street is part of a giant web of international financiers who serve the rich and powerful of the world. How? Let's start with tax havens. Tax havens have expanded enormously over the last 50 years, some in small island nations, some in Europe, in Switzerland, in Luxembourg, in Ireland. The two most important tax havens, and this may surprise you, are in Great Britain and the United States. Tax havens do not offer exemptions to their own residents. They target foreign investors. To them, they provide an escape from paying taxes, secrecy, and a chance to avoid laws in their home country. They are the home of many of the world's largest hedge funds, those private funds that allow the very rich to pool their investments and act collectively. It's estimated that about a quarter of all global wealth is now held in tax havens. Worldwide, the annual tax loss is at least $250 billion. For the U.S., it's about $100 billion. Individual politicians on both sides of the Atlantic have, to their credit, tried to bring in anti-tax haven legislation. But what is needed is a collaborative, intergovernmental approach to the problem, and that's not happening. Are there other ways in which the big banks act against the welfare of the general population? Let's talk about short selling. Imagine a broker in an investment bank borrows 1,000 shares valued at $10 each and then sells them. That gives the short seller $10,000. Assume the shares then go down in price to $9. At this point, the short seller will buy them back for $9,000, return them to the owner he borrowed them from, and pocket the $1,000 he's made. This isn't as risky as it sounds because investment banks are huge. They are thus able, along with the hedge funds with whom they're in collusion, to sell off large amounts of shares. What happens when there are more people selling than buying? The share price goes down. In reality, by acting together, the short sellers have made it go down. A large part of investment banks' profits are coming from short selling. For this information, we're grateful to a man called Robert Simpson. In the year 2005, Robert Simpson bought up all the shares in a company called Global Links Corporation, 1 million shares. He put the share certificates in his sock drawer and then watched as 60 million of his shares continued to be sold over a 2-day period. In other words, over 48 hours, each of his shares was traded 60 times, while the certificates remained in his sock drawer. What this story tells us is that the traders weren't even bothering to borrow shares for their short selling. They were making big money by trading with nothing. But the story is much bigger than that. The very act of shorting a share can make you appear to be an owner, and that enables you to vote at company shareholders' meetings. Offshore hedge funds are suspected of engaging in short selling just to vote on particular issues in which they are interested, like the hostile takeover of a particular company. They can do this because there is no one watching what they do. Lawsuits and repeated calls for investigation have made little headway and received very limited media attention. Between 1998 and 2005, over 7,000 small and medium-sized public companies were allegedly shorted out of existence. Let's move on to derivatives, in particular over-the-counter derivatives. Over-the-counter derivatives are basically side bets between two parties that some underlying investment will go up or down. That could be a stock, a commodity, a currency, an interest rate. These bets are unregulated. They're hard to trace because they're not on the books, and they involve leverage. Leverage is the use of borrowed funds to increase your purchasing power. Here's how it works. Assume a bank or a hedge fund places a 25-to-1 leveraged bet of $4,000 that oil prices will go up. Leveraging $4,000 at 25-to-1 enables them to place a bet on $100,000 worth of oil, using $96,000 in borrowed money that's nowhere on the broker's official books. If oil goes up by 6%, their investment becomes $106,000, and they've made $6,000 on that $4,000 leveraged bet. If it goes down by 6%, they've lost all their money, and they still owe another $2,000 on their bet. The massive leveraging of derivatives has been used by pools of unscrupulous traders to trigger huge currency sell-offs, usually that of a third world country. Result? The target country's currency drops dramatically in value. Essential imports and debt obligations become much more expensive, as the country must pay for them in international currencies, which now cost a lot more to purchase. The international bankers holding their debt then may oblige them to sell off public services like water or health care. Transnational corporations swoop in and buy them up, usually at bargain basement prices. Billionaire investor Warren Buffett has called derivatives financial weapons of mass destruction. The world derivative market is enormous, around $708 trillion at the end of 2011. To put that in perspective, the total GDP of the world was only $79 trillion in 2011. 95% of the U.S. derivative trade is in the hands of just 4 banks: J.P. Morgan Chase & Company, Citigroup, Bank of America, and Goldman Sachs. Could the derivative market collapse? Imagine a scenario where an investment bank or a major hedge fund bets too much on declining interest rates and loses too much. They can't pay up. So the counterparties, the groups they've bet against, can't collect. Result? Many of these winners, also low on capital, can't pay up on their own bets and debts in other derivative transactions. Suddenly there's a domino effect that leads to an economic crisis that's too big for any government to bail out. Derivatives played a role in the mortgage crisis that caused the 2008 taxpayers' bailout of the banks. Not that the banks mentioned that. They preferred to blame the crisis on irresponsible homeowners taking on mortgages they couldn't afford. We'd like to tell the story differently. Traditionally, depository banks have been cautious about who they gave mortgages to, because they didn't want to end up losing money if the mortgagees defaulted on their loans. This concern was eliminated back in the late 1990s when the big mortgage companies and the Wall Street investment banks began enthusiastically buying mortgages from the depository banks. The institutions would bundle the mortgages together, then slice and dice them up in complicated ways. These would be sold as mortgage-backed securities to clients around the world. Many of the clients would be banks. Insurance for these MBSs involved a form of derivative trading called credit default swaps. Credit default swaps allowed people to insure securities belonging to someone else, a bit like being allowed to take out an insurance policy on the car of your neighbor, who you think is a bad driver. Why? You're betting he or she will have an accident that will allow you to collect some insurance money. Mortgage corporations, big investment banks, and hedge funds were all dealing in credit default swaps. In order to finance these very profitable mortgage-related schemes, the banks and mortgage companies were leveraging their investments with ratios of between 15-to-1 and 80-to-1. In other words, they were getting bigger and bigger, but they were holding more and more debt. All of this growth depended on access to a lot of mortgages, which is why the financial institutions resorted to subprime mortgages. Subprime mortgages often required no down payment or a minimal amount, no credit reference from participants, and a very low starting interest rate that would be adjusted at a defined date in the future. People rushed into purchasing these low-interest adjustable rate mortgages. Remember, this was a time when President Bush was urging Americans to go out and spend money to stimulate the sluggish economy. Many of these people were not told that a mere 2% adjustment or rise in their interest rates in the future could lead to a doubling of monthly payments. This was predatory lending, because the lenders knew that could happen, and it was pervasive. Between 1994 and 2006, the subprime market in the United States ballooned from $35 billion to $1 trillion, with $814 billion of mortgage-backed securities issued. By 2006, 23% of all mortgages were subprime. With all this money available to buy houses, house prices went up and up and up. Then people's adjustable mortgage rates kicked in just when interest rates were themselves climbing. For some people, their monthly payments suddenly increased enormously. Result? Millions of foreclosures that year. Subprime mortgages had become toxic. That meant that mortgage-backed securities laced with subprime mortgages also became toxic. As it became clear how toxic these securities were, their value plummeted. The financial institutions that had insured them couldn't pay up, and the banks and mortgage corporations holding large quantities of dubious securities found nobody wanted to buy them at anywhere near their original value. These institutions began to have great difficulty finding the money to pay up on their own debts coming due. Credit had seized up everywhere. The financial empire was trembling. Did you know that America used to have some of the strongest laws in the world to prevent this kind of financial meltdown? But they were dismantled. There was the amazing 1992 decision to allow investment banks to trade in over-the-counter derivatives. Of great impact also was the 1999 repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act that had prevented regular banks from engaging in betting. Then in 2004, the Securities and Exchange Commission ruled that investment banks could hold more debt. The risky betting activity just kept getting bigger and bigger. What caused this deregulation? Part of the reason lies in an unquestioning faith in a free market ideology that insists that regulations inhibit economic growth. This ideological mantra has held a central place in the top business schools that provide the elite civil service jobs in Washington and the jobs on Wall Street. Harvard Business School and the University of Chicago School of Economics have a lot to answer for. But what converted the politicians to deregulation? Between 1998 and 2008, the financial sector alone gave $1.75 billion to the two political parties. That kind of corporate spending guarantees a lot of grateful elected members in the Senate and Congress. And it's going to get worse. The Supreme Court in its 2010 Citizens United decision has, in the words of Nobel Prize-winning economist Joseph Stiglitz, enshrined the right of corporations to buy government by removing limitations on campaign spending. And then there's lobbying. Lobbying is the act of attempting to influence decisions made by politicians or regulators. The U.S. financial sector alone employs 5 lobbyists for every member of Congress. So, who are these lobbyists? Wikipedia reports that between 1998 and 2010, 43% of the 198 members of Congress who left government to join the private sector registered to lobby. These lobbyists did their job well in 2008. That's when suddenly the Wall Street banks that had previously adamantly criticized government interference began begging government for help. They were too big to fail, they said. If they went under, the whole economy might flounder and sink. Exactly how large was the taxpayers' bailout? Many of you will probably say $750 billion. That's the figure that was presented to taxpayers. Actually, so far, $7.5 trillion has been spent, with a lot more promised. We know that thanks to Bloomberg News, who spent 2 years in court fighting a financial sector that obviously didn't want this information made public. As for Canada's bailout, the Crown Corporation Canadian Mortgage and Housing bought $69 billion worth of mortgage-backed securities from the banks. The Canadian government also put out $41 billion in credit to the banks to help them get over the tough times. And the 5 largest Canadian banks, which are active in the U.S. banking market, received another $33 billion in credit via American programs. Where did the great majority of money from American programs actually go? Not to homeowners. The money went largely to the huge mortgage companies and the TBTF banks. What did the too-big-to-fail banks do with the money? They bought up smaller banks and grew even bigger. They profited from government loans borrowed at 0.25% by reinvesting that money in government bonds paying 2.5% interest. They even increased bank charges, and then they gave themselves massive bonuses. And government went along with all this. An attempt has been made to re-regulate Wall Street with the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Act. But like Swiss cheese, this act has lots of holes in it. Lobbying and political contributions saw to that. As Canadians, we find it particularly unacceptable that both the Bank of Canada and the Canadian Finance Minister have lobbied against the Volcker Rule, the strongest part of that act. What's been the impact of this crisis? By 2011, 1 in 4 American homes were worth less than the value of their mortgages. Loans to small businesses by the 4 biggest banks had dropped by 53%. The unemployment rate had nearly doubled in 3 years. And state governments, faced with $300 billion shortfalls in revenues, were laying off teachers and healthcare workers, closing hospitals, and making cuts to pensions. But those banks that received the bailout? They're doing just fine. In 2011, 29% of all profits made in the United States economy came from the financial sector. This is a sector that produces almost nothing itself. Think about that. And think about the message this sector delivers. Why bother starting a company, hiring workers, producing a product or service, and contributing to community growth? Why not instead make money by trading in a rigged casino? Oh, and do use the tax havens. We'd like to close with 4 points. First, big finance's tax havens allow the rich to effortlessly get richer by evading or avoiding their fair share of taxes, yet little effort is made to constrain these activities. Second, while it may not be illegal, big finance's coordinated sabotage of businesses and governments is devious and unethical, yet little effort is made to constrain these activities. Third, by redirecting the flow of money through their tax havens into derivative trading and other games, big finance is deliberately starving the real economy of productive investments. And finally, big finance has generated massive bubbles of fake growth, and that endangers the jobs and futures of virtually everyone. And that is why so many of us, young and old, from all walks of life, and from different parts of the world, have become occupiers. We've focused on the United States experience because Americans are our closest neighbors and friends. But as this story unfolds in Europe and elsewhere, it's becoming more and more clear to everybody that the financial malaise is international. How do we try to solve it? Like President Roosevelt, we believe that big finance must be constrained and reformed. Who's going to push for that? Why not us as part of the 99%? This presentation is the first in a planned series explaining why we've mobilized as occupiers. Check the others out. Or better still, come to one of our meetings and check us out. See you there.